So Kant says, the problem is, from the point that you realize the nature of the moral law and your obligation relative to it, you at the same time realize you've already failed to live up to it. Because the moral law demands you be morally perfect. And by the time you understand the nature of the demand, you realize that you have not been perfect, and that the probability is not great that you ever will be perfect. And Kant actually acknowledges that this creates a sort of a motivation problem. Because how are you going to be motivated to try to live up to the moral law, to the demands of the law, when it's going to be pretty clear to you that you're not going to succeed? And, you've already failed.
It's like a television. You just turn it down.
Yeah, it's okay. And then he says something that's very charming to me. I love this about Kant. He says, what happens is you look at your life from that point at which you understood the true nature of the moral law and the demand that it makes on you. And you look from that point forward, like say it was last week or something like that. And you see, says Kant, a slight improvement in your character. You see that you're a little bit better than you were before you understood the true nature of the moral law and its demand on you, whatever. And he says, and that encourages you, that little improvement in your character, from the point at which you understood the nature of the moral law. That propels your efforts into, the future to try to live up to the nature of the moral law or to the demand of the moral law. And, it just shows you, and Nietzsche talks about this, that how philosophy is like, disguised autobiography. That Kant was a really upbeat sort of guy, because Kant doesn't focus on your failure. Kant focuses on your success. So for Kant, you have a little success, and that's all you need, to try to keep trying to live up to the moral law. For Kierkegaard, that's just not good enough.
Yeah, the Kierkegaard World Despair
biography. For Kierkegaard, it's like, oh my God, from that point at which you understood the true nature of the moral law and its demand on you, you still weren't perfect. You still failed to be perfect. Oh my God, that's even worse than before you understood that you should be perfect. Well, so what happens to the ethicist starts out like the Kantian. But what happens to the ethicist is something analogous to what happens to the aesthete. You're just miserable. You're just miserable. You're not living up to the demands of the moral law, and you don't know why. Because the moral law appears to have the expectation that you can be perfect. And you know that you can't be. And so there's this lack of fit which causes you to despair. And so then what happens is the religious interpretation of existence has sin, which the ethical interpretation doesn't really have. Sin explains why you can't live up to the demands of the moral law.
Is this sin in the sense of original sin, or sin in the sense of just sin?
I think it's got to be in the sense of original sin.
They're the same. They're kind of the same things as you transcend.
It's some flaw in your character that means that you're not going to be able to be morally perfect. That you need God.
It has a hereditary aspect to it, but in the way we think of original sin, it's not quite the same.
Well, the point is, he doesn't want you to get bogged down thinking about Adam and how you inherited whatever. But the point is that there's an inadequacy in you. It's not anything specific that you did. Like Kierkegaard never focuses on particular things people do, because he says all the particular things that you do, lying, stealing, whatever. It's mostly just not wanting to be yourself, which is the sin for Kierkegaard. But all the things that you do that you regret, that you feel bad about, all the times you failed to live up to the men of the moral law, whatever, they're all traceable back to some weakness in you, to some inherent inadequacy, and that you can characterize in a general sense as sin.
Which is also characterized as our distance from God.
Yeah.
The greater in sin we are, the further we are in our relation from God. We're more related to different types of other than God, whereas when we overcome sin, we are in relation to God. And then, as I recall it in Sequence Unto Death at least, the only specific action he accounts for as sin is to reject God, to take offense. That's the only specific action equals out as being a sinful action. Everything else, you're just kind of in sin by your normal actions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'll come back to that when we talk specifically about Christianity. But the advantage that the religious interpretation of existence, the religious stage, has over the ethical stage is sin. The ethical stage, I mean, that's the advantage in an explanatory sense, because what happens to the ethical person is they fail. You know, I mean, the ethical interpretation of existence is more plausible than the aesthetic, in that it makes more sense of suffering, you know, because it's hard to be human and to live up to the man and moral law and whatever. So yeah, you're gonna suffer. What it can't explain is that inherent inability to live up to the Son of Man. The religious can explain that through sin. So you move from the aesthetic interpretation to the ethical one because your suffering starts to discredit the aesthetic interpretation. You get in the ethical one, and your suffering starts to discredit that one, and that will hopefully propel you to the religious one, which explains the nature of your suffering through reference to sin, which the ethical interpretation doesn't really get. But I should qualify this, actually, because there's a lot of evidence that Kierkegaard didn't really think the ethical was a self-sustaining existence sphere. That there's really the two compelling interpretations of existence for Kierkegaard are the aesthetic and religious.
Well, the ethical one seems to just kind of be, oh yeah, well, yeah, we actually do need ethics. I can't just do what I want. It just seems to be that sort of realization.
Yeah. Well, it's. I think he doesn't really think it's not a fully fleshed. Yeah, it's a sort of a transitional ground between the aesthetic and the religious. Yeah.
But to be fair, he does say that you can choose to live in one of these stages, one was prior to religion, and still have a level of happiness. Not a true fulfillment, but you can still take pleasure in your life. You can still be existentially fulfilled.
In the ethical?
In the ethical or the aesthetic, it just won't be as rich as it is during the religious. Your experience won't be as meaningful as it would be, but you can still completely take pleasure in the aesthetic, and that can be your entire life.
Yes, but I think he would not say you could be fulfilled.
You could
you can't be fulfilled.
You could exist for.
No, I don't even think you can really be happy. You can appear to be happy, but this is an important thing to remember. Well,
yes.
This is an important thing to remember about Kierkegaard. He was dogmatically religious. You know, he believed that Christianity was true. You know, he never tries to defend this because he thought actually there were enough apologists for Christianity. People were trying to make it plausible and make sense. So, you know, he was trying to, you know, lay out the difficulties, and I'll get into that in more detail in a few minutes. But he was dogmatically religious. So ultimately for Kierkegaard, you can't be happy outside of Christianity. You won't be. You can be what?
You have about another 15 minutes before your battery dies.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, well, why don't you stop at like 5 minutes before it dies?
All right, well, I'll stop at around 55. Go ahead.
Okay. You can, but that's what the Sickness Unto Death is about. He thinks everybody who's not Christian is in despair. You know, whether you know it, yes, whether you know it or not. You know,
that's
I mean,
the dogmatic.
Yes.
That's the dogmatic element of his belief.
Yes.
Apart from that, I don't think there's any dogmatic belief about Christianity.
Yeah, but that is that he very emphatically believes that. He does have that view, like we were saying at the beginning of this discussion. He does have that view that everybody has a nature that is specific to them, you know, that they are supposed to actualize in their existence, and that nature is determined by God, and part of that nature is recognizing that it was determined by God and having a proper relation to God. And ultimately, I think for Kierkegaard, you don't really overcome sin. That sin is going to be part of human existence no matter what, even for the believing Christian. But you remember when Johannes Müller was saying that people have no greater need than to feel loved. You know, and you really just can't give people enough of that impression. You know, they have an unending need to feel loved. Well, for Kierkegaard, what Christianity does is it answers that need. So it doesn't say, I'll make you good enough to be loved, You know, Christ for Kierkegaard doesn't come into existence and say, "Ding, you're perfect. Now God loves you." It says, God loves you, you know, already, as you are, with your sin and everything. And that if you can believe that, you'll be happy. And only if you can believe that will you ever be happy. You'll never get enough confirmation from other people. You'll never be famous enough. You'll never be rich enough. You'll never have enough people who love you deeply enough that need to feel loved and accepted will ultimately be satisfied. So for Kierkegaard, anybody who's outside of Christianity is ultimately not happy. You know, but you can ask that. You know, you can flee into all kinds of activities that will distract you from the fact that you're unhappy. Yeah, you know, like the aesthete who's engaged with the interesting or with sensual pleasure, or the ethical person who's really kind of almost